With us today is Lisa Bloom. I met Lisa through a friend of ours, a mutual friend, Ron Friedman, who has also been on this podcast. So if you haven't heard his podcast, it's well worth listening to, one of the earlier podcasts that I did. And he introduced me with Lisa, and Lisa wanted to talk to me about a book that she was writing. And when we began to talk about it over email, I thought it would be interesting to have her as a guest on the show. So this is going to be a little bit of a different kind of show. She's going to start by telling us a little bit about the book that she's writing, and I'll ask her some questions, and then we'll be in conversation about it. The book is about leadership presence, and she's been coaching leaders and entrepreneurs for years through storytelling. That's her focus. Right? She's a storyteller, and she uses storytelling. And she was really interested in presence, in presence, in presentation presence and leadership presence. And when she talked to people about it and said, what is leadership presence? The leaders that she was working with would respond with something like charisma. But they, couldn't quite understand exactly what it is, and yet they could identify people who had it. And I imagine that you, as listeners, could probably do the same. You could probably identify people who have leadership presence, and Lisa's goal in her new book is to unpack that and to sort of understand what is leadership presence. The title of the book is Demystifying Leadership Presence, Mastering the 4 Core Stories. So she's interviewing people, myself included, around understanding that, and I wanted to turn the tables on her and interview her back so that we can learn a little bit before the book comes out about what this thing called leadership presence is, what the 4 core stories are, and then we'll be in a conversation. So with that long introduction, Lisa, welcome to the Bregman Leadership Podcast.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here. I'm looking forward to this conversation.
So tell us a little bit about, sort of demystifying leadership presence. You may want to start with the 4 core stories, or maybe a little bit about, some background around leadership presence.
Yeah, sure. So, as you said, I come from a storytelling background, and I'm often hired to come in to senior leaders before they have a really big event to help them with their stage presence, to help them with finding the right story to tell that's going to engage the audience and make them feel comfortable and really have that level of kind of interaction that they're looking for. And I think we all recognize that many great leaders are great storytellers. So it's a skill that people are looking to acquire. But what I started to notice was that the leaders who really struggled most with stage presence were actually also struggling with leadership presence. And when I would, as you mentioned, I would ask, so what is leadership presence? People would say, oh, it's charisma. And I'd say, well, don't you know any leaders that, the typical, the leader walks in the room and we feel her presence. What is that? And I would say, don't you know any leaders who have that sense, who have that presence, but are not particularly charismatic? And they would all say, oh, yeah, sure, absolutely. So that's when I kind of set off on this journey to look at, well, what is presence? And when I looked at the research and when I spoke to people, I seem to find 2 almost extremes in the field. So one of them would be, well, leadership presence is all about how you look, what you wear, how you stand, and your voice, and all about kind of, high-level presentation skills. And then the other area would be, it's all about how kind of zen you are. If you practice yoga and meditation and mindfulness every single day. And it just seemed like the model out there was 2 major extremes, and that something had to be there that would encompass everything, that would be more holistic. And that's when I discovered these 4 stories, which I believe is really a way to not only understand leadership presence, but also to develop it and to master it, and through mastering these stories.
So share the 4 stories with us.
Sure. So there's 2 different levels, and there's 2 different focuses. So there's a higher level and there's a lower level, and there's the internal focus and the external focus. Let me just give you some background to that. What I notice also is that when people talk about story, very often they're talking about the story out, as in the story that people are impressed by, what you tell about yourself, the story that's focusing outwards. And I remember I was at an entrepreneurial event a couple of years ago in California, and I noticed that there was such a huge dichotomy between what I see as the outer story and the inner story. So in the room full of happy, abundant entrepreneurs, there was all this talk of success and, how everything is in flow and everything's wonderful. And every time I would go to the bathroom, I would hear these women talk about, the divorces and the drug addict kids and the cancers and all the real stuff, the inner story. And I just thought to myself, there's something about authenticity around the integration and connection between the inner and outer story. And so that's where, again, another starting point for all this research and a lot of the work that I do. So the 4 stories really focus on the external focus and the internal focus.
And let me ask you a question. Let me interrupt for a second and ask you a question about the way you're using the word story. So, I tell bedtime stories to my children.
Right.
The way you're using story, it sounds like, what is our story? Like, what is the story that we're living? And am I thinking about this correctly?
Yes, and it's also what's the story we're telling, because, whatever you do, if you are a leader or if you're in the business of supporting leaders, coaching leaders, interested in leadership, we are telling stories all the time. Within an organization, stories are just ripe with, organizations are just ripe with stories, and stories are often the cause of both positive and negative, huge impact, both culturally and in terms of even sales and revenues. So if a product has a good story, it tends to succeed. If an organization tells strong stories, the culture tends to be a positive culture. And when you shift a story, you can end up with a very negative or toxic environment.
And is that true also for the internal story? So it sounds like that would be true for the external story. Is the internal story also a story that we actually tell, or is it a story that we tell ourselves?
Well, it's very often it's the story we tell ourselves. It has huge impact on the story we tell out, particularly if there's a big differentiation between the two, if there's a distance.
There's a misalignment.
There's a misalignment, and one affects the other.
Right.
So it's, some people call it, when you think about the imposter syndrome, where people are hugely successful but have this inner story that says, I'm successful until they discover that I actually don't know anything and I'm faking. That's been written about quite a lot.
Right.
We have many internal stories, inner stories that either sabotage our success or that hold us back, hold us from reaching our greatness. And that is true of leaders, and it's true of everybody.
So I would guess that you are not a fan of the fake it until you make it kind of concept, that ultimately the fake it until you make it is, I'm going to project an outer story that I don't actually yet feel internally.
Look, I think it can work as an exercise. I can definitely recognize that you can grow into a story. And I definitely believe that we can create and co-create stories that are visionary, that are inspirational in order to reach that. And oftentimes I'll work with teams and organizations where we'll create a fantastic future story, which inevitably, once they've created it, they will reach it. Once they've envisioned it, they will create it. So yes, there is a sense of you create the story, then you turn it into reality, because that's what we do. Whatever story we tell becomes our reality.
Right.
So if we want to craft something that really inspires us as a way to move forward or a goal, then there's much more likelihood that if it's a solid story, we're actually going to be able to make it real.
Got it. Okay, so there's this external story and the internal story. Those are two of the core stories?
Well, it actually breaks down further. There are two that point out, there are two that point in. So the first level of the external story is simply the story people tell about you. Mm-hmm. Now, oftentimes people will say, the story people tell about me, well, what do I have? What influence do I have on that? And people tend to think, I don't have any influence. They'll tell whatever they want to tell. But of course, the model breaks down the ways in which we can deeply influence the story that people tell about you. And a huge percentage of that story is something that we can control and we can influence. So that's the first story. On the second level of the external focus, it's the story that you tell them. So, we are telling stories all the time. Oftentimes we're telling them quite unconsciously in terms of the effect it has on other people. Mm-hmm. So in leadership, if you are focused and you can master the story that you tell them, then you're going to have much more success and much more presence.
Great.
So they're the two externally focused stories.
And what are the two internally focused stories?
So on the first level, the internally focused story, it's the story you tell yourself.
Right.
And that's part of what I've already described, this sense of, the inner voice, what you believe. It's, the kinds of commitments that you have, the convictions you have, the mindset, and so on. And then on the deeper level, the internal focus is what I call the story you are. And this is much more to do with your self-development, your personal mastery, your purpose, more on the being level. And that's a deeper, that one for managers who are not quite at that senior level. That's harder sometimes for them to grasp, but it's fantastic in terms of creating a developmental plan, because at the senior levels, they get it. They know what that means. Right. The story you are is that solid base from which you take a stand and from which you feel confident.
So if you could do this in a minute or two, give us a quick story of a leader who could be an example that you could use as you think about her use of these sort of 4 stories.
Well, I think we all recognize, I'm not sure I understand the question. You want an example of a leader in a situation who uses
or just an example, you could share an example of a leader that that you've worked with, that you've coached, who is telling, we all tell ourselves all these 4 stories, these 4 core stories exist whether we like it or not. And so, right. It would be interesting, right now it's conceptual, it would be interesting to see it or hear about it in an example of someone who has these stories.
Sure. So I have a great example of a CEO that I worked with who told me a kind of an anecdote of something that had happened to him as he was a young manager before he got to a senior level. And he said that he was involved in a negotiation for a very big deal between 2 large companies. And the deal kind of was about to be clinched, and the 2 most senior leaders who were basically about to sign the contract were going to go out for dinner and spend time over dinner discussing the fine details and come to the actual agreement. And what happened was the leader who was, I think he was either a president or the CEO of this company, he'd invited the other person. And he was going to make this final decision whether to buy this project, buy this company. And he invited the guy for dinner, and the guy sat down, and they were in a very nice restaurant, and the server came along and began to serve them water and asked them if they were ready to order. And something in the way that this other leader responded to the server and was very offhand and quite rude, the man refused to sign the contract. He actually did not sign the contract as a result of the fact that this leader was not, this kind of decent human being who was willing to treat serving staff as human beings and in the way in which they need to be respected. And that to him reflected a level of leadership that was not acceptable. This guy held a standard to the way you treat people. Do you know the name of the person who cleans your office? Do you take time to acknowledge the people who serve you at the lowest levels, not just the ones at the highest levels? That was part of his leadership presence and the model that he wanted to give to others.
So that makes sense to me entirely. Connect it to the 4 stories, the 4 core stories, because I'm missing that connection a little bit.
Well, that fits in with the behavior around the story that you tell them, the story that your not just your business knowledge, not just your level of risk taking, but actually your interpersonal skills, how you acknowledge other people, how you listen, how you connect, how you respect people. So that's one of the ways in which we break down and teach the story you tell them.
So you're not actually literally telling them a story, but your actions tell them a story, and what you do, Absolutely. How you show up in the world, creates a story for the outside world to see.
Yeah, because presence isn't a once upon a time story.
Right.
Okay, it's not a once upon a. It's how you show up. Much of it is wordless. The way in which you have an impact on somebody is often not about what you say to them. It's about a lot of things, and one of them is the story you tell and the way you show up and the way you act towards people and the way you connect with people and how you respect people.
Got it. Okay, great. So I understand. I think listeners probably understand, these sort of 4 stories. We're about halfway through. Let's switch over and have a conversation about it. Do you have questions for me that you want to ask related to this?
Absolutely. So I actually want to ask you what your opinion is of leadership presence, because I know you've come across it. I know you probably work with it quite a lot. How would you describe leadership presence?
It's interesting that you talk about this feeling that someone walks in the room and you just notice them. And to me, there's something very energetic about that. So this is, might for some people feel woo-woo, but you feel it from someone. And yes, so maybe it has to do with their size. We all know 6'4" people who walk in, it's hard not to notice them. But I also think, we have, if you remember Malcolm Gladwell's book, Blink, we have these instantaneous reactions to people. I will meet someone, and in a millisecond, I'll feel like I either like them or I don't like them. Now, I know enough to say, these might be connected to my prejudices and my biases and the stories that I tell myself and, all sorts of things, so I can question that. But there's an immediate energy you get from someone. And, what does that have to do with? I think that's very much the internal story, right? It's very much the sense of groundedness. Are they in their bodies? When we teach leadership, when we work with leaders, we do a lot of physical work, because if you're not in your body, in my view, you'll never have that leadership presence, right? Because we're physical beings. I mean, someone walks in the room, they're walking in the room, or if they're in a wheelchair, they're wheeling in the room, but they're a physical body. And that physicality is important. And how you inhabit your body, I think, makes a big difference. So, my view of leadership presence has to do with the physicality and the emotion and the intellectual, mental piece and the spiritual piece. So when we talk about the 4 stories integrating, I think it's important to have integration in your physicality, your emotion, your mental, intellectual aspect, and the spiritual aspect. And we know people who are comfortable in themselves. Like, they're just comfortable in themselves. When someone is a little too formal, then they have, in effect, a mask, right? They're wearing some kind of a mask that allows for that formality. And my view of leadership presence is the mask is attempting to hide a vulnerability, and hiding vulnerability weakens leadership presence. I think we connect with each other emotionally in vulnerability, not really even in strength. And so a mask is trying to project this story out into the world of, strength. And great if you feel it and if you have it. But if there's vulnerability and compassion and empathy and connection, that's how we connect with people. And we connect with people in points of pain, probably more than we connect with people in points of, admiration and strength. So to me, I think all of that fits into leadership presence.
Beautiful. Yeah, I love that. Thank you. So do you think it's learnable? I mean, is this something that people are born with, or do you think that they can learn it and develop it and master it?
I always think that the dichotomous question is somewhere in the middle, right? That it's are you born with it? Well, as I had Jim Kouzis, who was on the show, and I interviewed, and we were talking about, he wrote the Leadership Challenge, and we were talking about leadership, and he spoke to this, are you born with, are you born with it, or do you learn it? And he says, well, everybody's born, right? So we'll start there, right? Like, if you've been born with something. And, I think it's a combination. I have no idea, right? I mean, I have no idea. Is it learnable? Absolutely. Like, will some people be able to go further with their learning than others? Probably, right? It's, some people are so uncomfortable with themselves that just increasing their comfort with themselves, finding yourself in your body an additional 20% will increase your leadership presence. Will you have as much leadership presence as, people who have been comfortable in their bodies for 40, 50 years? It will probably take you some time to get there. Are there things that you can do to become more comfortable and grounded in your body? 100%, absolutely, no question. So I think the question of are you born with it or can you learn it is too black and white. And my answer is you can always learn it. You can always get better from where you are. You can always show more leadership presence. And my view is that the distinction between showing leadership presence and being comfortable and connected in your life is a very thin line. And so to me, the advantage of of gaining leadership presence is, you walk in the world with more assurity than you would otherwise.
I love that. And I love your focus on the whole grounding and the body side to it, because as a storyteller, there's something that really speaks to me. We train, as my background as a professional storyteller is training to be able to tell from your body, to embody the story. So that's so much about, leadership. Thank you. Yeah.
That's great. And how do you do that? I'm curious. How do you, in a sense or two, how do you help people really ground themselves in their bodies?
Well, from storytelling, I mean, I have all these techniques that I do, from walking barefoot as you practice the story to visualizing the actual physicality of the story in terms of time and space. There's lots of techniques. With leaders and for stage presence, similarly, we do a lot of actual physical work. Moving around the stage, moving your body, getting to a place of comfort. And you're so right. It's about the person's individual comfort with themselves first and foremost. If that's not there, you have to work on that before you can move forward to great stage presence and leadership presence.
That's great.
Yeah.
It reminds me, when I was in college, I took a class. I forgot this until now. I took a class on storytelling. And the thing that really stuck with me, we all chose a story to tell. And there were a number of things that we did this was not a class for credit, by the way. This was, this was an extracurricular thing. But we all chose a story to tell. And part of the process that I remember most is we had to draw out the story. We basically drew sort of cartoon versions. We had to, we had 30 boxes, and we had to fill each box with elements of the story.
Storyboard, yeah.
Storyboard, thank you. We had to storyboard it.
Yeah.
And I'm not a great drawer, that's never been my forte. Maybe I could probably improve on it, because I think you can learn things and not just be born into them. But I remember how surprising it was, how essential it was to storyboard it, and how clearly I saw what I was saying when I was telling the story, how clearly I saw it as though I were there. And I wonder what you think of storyboarding as a way of getting ourselves really in that story, maybe even creating storyboards about our own story, about who we are in the world. I wonder, have you thought about that or tried that?
Yeah, I mean, I've played with the idea a little bit. I tend to because as a storyteller, I like the activity of stories. So, for example, for me, when I'm practicing and preparing for whether it's a speaking event or, my speaking events are all full of stories. So when I'm practicing that, I'll be out walking. I'll put on headphones because I'm going to be talking out loud and I don't want to look like an entire lunatic to my neighborhood. But, I'll be out there talking, telling the story, doing movements, and so on. And so for me, it's not so much putting it on paper, although I think storyboarding it's a fantastic tool. But definitely, they say, as a storyteller, if you see your story, your audience will see the story. And that is absolutely true. And in fact, now neuroscience is proving that there's this whole mirroring effect that happens. If you can see the story as you tell it, if you can truly embody the story, then the story is going to come across as authentic and real and compelling and resonant for people. Okay. And I believe that it's the same with any type of communication for leaders. I mean, it's such a critical skill to be able to do that. So, yeah. So another quick question, because I'm conscious of the time and I've got so much to ask you here. Okay, we've established it's learnable, everything's learnable. Do you think that there's a particular method of learning that's going to be more powerful? And maybe this is a skewed question because we're both leadership coaches, but do you think, for example, teaching, coaching, mentoring, putting people in a certain environment so that they're exposed to certain situations is the best way to teach this skill of leadership presence?
What I think is that yes to all of those questions, right? That I think that we learn in so many different ways, and so many elements of learning come into play. So I'm not a huge advocate of sitting in a classroom and having someone just teach me something from a PowerPoint and write it down. On the other hand, I want to say that it's useful to learn a new concept, right? It's useful to understand new things intellectually. Now, if it stays intellectual, you probably won't be able to integrate it. So You know,
Sure.
I think there's space for everything. There's space to teach new information. There's space to try it out. I think ultimately we never really learn it until we're taking real risks with it, because the challenge in taking a risk is, am I willing to feel something? And if I'm not willing to feel something, if I'm not willing to feel, the risk of showing up authentically and in vulnerability, and I'm not willing to feel that at all, then I probably, when I'm standing on a stage, I definitely won't project it. So
Right.
I think we have to grow our capacity to feel a variety of things. And that has to be part of the learning process, because if it's not, it's what I call emotional courage. And if we're not growing our emotional courage, then we're probably not going to act when we're not going to show up in the way we want to show up in real life. But I think mixing it all up, and certainly, real time, real places, real people, is how we, end up fully integrating the new behavior and go from, something that's sort of consciously we're working on to something that unconsciously becomes a part of who we are.
Right, right. Great. Yeah, I love that. So, in terms of leadership capabilities, do you think this is a big one? Do you think this is important? Do you think that, personally, do you think it's an important capability to have leadership presence? Do you think that it's recognized within organizations as an important capability? And again, when I say leadership presence, I'm not talking about necessarily standing on a stage and addressing 2,000 people.
Right.
I'm talking about the way you interact and show up in all parts of your leadership. How important is this?
I think it's a critical skill, in my view. And it, I was going to say, I guess I'm about to say, but is that you have to be careful not to be a shell of leadership presence, meaning to have leadership presence without anything underneath it. But the truth is, I think that's impossible. Meaning, I think if you're going to show up really with leadership and presence, there has to be an authenticity to it. Otherwise, energetically, you're going to convey that. It's going, like I could see through people, you could see through people, everybody listening here can see through people all the time, and that doesn't mean that they won't be in very senior leadership roles in the world and politics and whatever. But at the same time, it's you don't necessarily want to follow them. And so,
Right.
But leadership presence, I want to go so far as to say I think it's a life skill. Like, not only is it important in leaders, I think it's important in anybody. I am attracted to people who have presence, who are able to, be confident in themselves, be generous with others. People who are a little scared and insecure often show up as arrogant, and they might even have presence, right? They might have a lot of presence on stage, but that arrogance kills the relationship. And so I think there has to be an authenticity and a clarity from the inside out. You talk about the inside story and the outside story, and I think they have to match, because otherwise it's thin and it's very easy to sort of see through it. It doesn't hold up under pressure.
Yeah, I see such a connection between authenticity and leadership presence, in that if it's not the real deal, you sense it a mile away. You can just know that that's the case. So, yeah, thank you. You've answered a ton of questions, and I've loved your insights, and I really appreciate it.
Thank you too. This has been a really fun podcast, very different than, or maybe not so different. I'm always in conversations with people, but I really enjoyed hearing about the 4 core stories at the beginning and then being in a conversation with it. So I'm excited to read this book when it comes out. You'll have to let me know, and I'll let the listeners of the podcast know. And thank you so much for being on the Bregman Leadership Podcast.
Thank you.